All right, guys, and welcome back. So, today we're going to be taking a look at some of the independence movements that have been going on around the world, some of which happened during the time of the Cold War, and a little bit is, before or after. But basically, since like World War II, countries that have worked on independence, like basically getting rid of the colonial structure. All right. So after World War II, big changes politically are going to happen all around the world. Basically, what I just said before. Pretty obvious, right? So, colonialism, we're going to start seeing shifts with that. Uh, the practice is basically going to come to an end. There's really not colonies anymore, and there haven't been for some time. A lot of leaders are going to basically state that, like, no country has the right to control another country. So independence is the issue of the time, right? And also, like, is it really a good idea to spend all that money to control another country when they clearly don't want to be controlled from outside powers? So the independence movements, the first one we're going to look at is India, which had influence and control by the British for a long, long time. All right. And now they are a democratic nation. They're the Republic of India. They have independence now, but we're going to take a look at how that came to be. All right. So, India, we know it's the subcontinent. It is that big chunk of land that is in central southern Asia. All right. It is known as British India for a long time, and then it becomes India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, as well as the island of Sri Lanka. Right? These four countries basically make up what is called British India before the independence movement took hold and became a success. So, British rule India basically from the 1700s into the 1900s. They steadily grew in their power and control in India by manipulating economics and political influence to where they basically ran everything and had the government of India as their puppet. All right. So right at the beginning of World War II, 1939, is when the resistance for an independent India is really going to be amplified. All right? Because the British, they were forcing them to fight in World War II. The Indian people basically wanted to stay out. So, yeah, that didn't work out too well. Now, World War II is going to basically spark this whole nationalist independence movement. And the primary man that we need to know the name of here is Mohandas Gandhi, who was the nonviolent leader of gaining a independent India. So he's going to promote nonviolence. If you fight, that gives them an excuse to use violence, and being non-cooperative. So we're not going to fight them, and we're not going to help them. We're basically going to sit and do nothing until they realize that they can't control us. That is his message. And there's a picture of him. He was just this little old man who just wore traditional like Indian robes and things like that. And yeah. So the nonviolence. Yeah, it would serve as an inspiration for who, might you think? And if you think Dr. King, yes, you'd be thinking right. Gandhi was a huge influence on Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in America in the 1960s and into the 70s. So we're going to get what is called the Indian National Congress. This is going to stem with India's struggle against the British, and also dealing with the fact that there are two major religions in India, the Hindu religion and Islam. And their political parties are basically going to fall under religious lines. So, yeah, that it's going to lead to some political issues. And what we're going to get today is that in modern India, we have it's called the Republic of India for its full name. It's the second most populated country, but it is the largest democratic nation in the world. China's government is technically communist still, so keep that in mind. India is the largest democratic nation. They have federal system, so they have a lot of similarities to places like the United States and Great Britain and other democratic nations. Now, religious issues, like I said before, politically, they divide along religious lines. So, like India, you have the Hindus, and Pakistan, which is like a country that borders Western India. Uh, they're a separate nation now, but at one time they were the same country. This political and religious division would help spark the separation into separate nations. So this is India today. You can see the lighter shade of brown is what India looks like. And this area here that is darker is Pakistan. And here's Bangladesh, which is another more Muslim area. And down here, Sri Lanka is that island nation. So India, it is a modern country. They have cities, gigantic buildings like you might find in like New York or Chicago or Los Angeles here, as well as the ancients. So for anybody who is not aware of what this building is called, this is the Taj Mahal. So democracy in India. One of the big leaders alongside Gandhi was this guy, Jawaharlal Nehru, and he would want to bring a lot of Western influences to help bring India into, the now times. So bringing new industrialization, so factories, machines. So it's going to be less people focused and start getting, because India has such a large population that they could actually do the old way of doing things, like having everybody sit in buildings, just making stuff by hand. And it would cost just as much or less than doing it in England with machines. So they were very much behind, decades, if not, 100 years or so in like factory and industrialization methods because of their large population. But Nehru, he wants to change that. He wants to modernize India and bring them to the forefront so that they can contend with places like the United States and Great Britain and France and places like that. And he's also going to push for prohibiting discrimination against people's caste, the social class that they are born into and they are in for their entire lives. But of course, ethnic and religious differences, Hindu and Muslim, that's going to cause a lot of issues. But because of the economic development that's going to happen from industrialization, we're going to have fewer financial problems in India. And here is a picture of Nehru and Gandhi sitting in like one of the many, many meetings that they would have been in together. All right, we're also going to shift gears and talk about African independence a little bit. Just thinking to yourself, what's one country that you imagine we're going to be talking about as well as one person we'll be talking about? It's a Southern African nation. All right, so moving into it, African independence. we're going to start seeing the United Nations basically working to get rid of the colonial system and allow self-determination, the right for countries to pursue their own ways of doing things, running themselves. All right, so it challenges the imperialism of Europe and moves towards independence. So a charter is going to be given to Africa stating that you have the right for self-determination. You have the right to be your own nation and to run your own affairs. So this is going to result in both peaceful and violent revolutions and independence movements in Africa, in the various countries after World War II is over. There's going to be a big boost in pride of being African in Africa because of this charter. And of course, a big resentment of the European nations that have been in control for, decades, if not centuries. Now, who wants independence? Pretty much all of them. So in West Africa, the side that's closest to us, a lot of peaceful transitions are going to happen. Algeria, that is one of the larger North African countries. They want independence from France, and they fight a bloody war of independence for that. Something that you should keep in mind with Algeria is that for the longest time, it was considered a part of France because they were tied so closely to each other. So that is going to be a pretty big deal that they want independence. All right, Kenya. This one is a interesting one because it's a very violent struggle. This guy named Jomo Kenyatta, he is the basically military leader, and he is going to basically push out the European influence and set up basically a small dictatorship for a little while. And the country of Kenya is, of course, named after him because you see Kenya in Kenyatta, his last name. Now, South Africa, if that was your guess from my question earlier, that is correct. And South Africa, huge struggle of segregation of the races, also known as apartheid. So that is legal segregation, and it was basically in place from 1948 to 1994. So that's a very recent thing that happened. Now, the rights of the non-white people were very limited compared to the minority of white people that were there. So we get this fight for Black independence led by, if you guessed Nelson Mandela earlier, you would be correct. And he would become the first Black president of the Republic of South Africa. And there is a picture of him. If you do not know what he looks like, he kind of resembles Morgan Freeman a little bit. Now, the Middle East is also going to see a big shift in things going on because there had been European influence for a very long time there as well, basically since the end of World War I. So we're looking at, by this time, 70 plus 75 years of influence up into the 1990s when some of this stuff would be happening. Some of it is going to happen earlier in the 60s and 70s, but even still, looking at 40, 50 years of influence in some countries' cases. Now, the mandate system, this is what happened after World War I when the losing countries like the Ottoman Empire was dissolved and their territories were broken up and held under the control of different European nations like the British and the French, and basically would manage them until they saw fit that these people could run the countries for themselves. All right, so some of the French mandates, the French territories were places like Syria and Lebanon, and the British had influence over places like Jordan, originally known as the country of Transjordan. as well as Palestine, which the majority of that territory would later become Israel at the end of World War II as a new Jewish homeland. Now, we're going to see a woman named Golda Meir pop up in the Middle Eastern discussion. She would be a prime minister of Israel. She would be the leader during what is called the Yom Kippur War, which is one of the several wars that Israel would fight in the 20 years after they were formed, where they were attacked by multiple Arab nations that surrounded them, Muslim nations, and they stomped everybody that they fought against to where they were actually gaining territory from all the nations around them. Right? She got support from the U.S. In this, and we have been an ally to Israel basically since the creation of Israel back in the 40s. And here she is. All right, Gamal Abdel Nasser. This guy, he was the president of Egypt for about 14 years until he died. He would actually bring the Suez Canal under Egyptian control. It had been built and maintained for a long time by the British. And he would actually be an ally of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So they were actually part of the Warsaw Pact, which was the big alliance system of the Soviet Union and their puppet governments and their allies. Now, the Aswan High Dam would be built. This was a big way to basically have a supply of water for the country, like a big reservoir, as well as hydroelectric power in Egypt. And here he is. All right, a couple world organizations that you need to know about. The European Union is basically a political union of European countries, most of them, and are going to have a lot of trade benefits, and this is where the euro comes from, the currency that could be spent in any of the member nations. The United Nations, they are going to replace the League of Nations after World War II, and they are a much more effective organization because they can actually enforce the rules and regulations and laws that they are decreeing on international levels for their member nations. So member countries, they have to supply certain percentages of the military force that the UN can bring to bear on people who violate human rights and are being aggressive towards their neighbors. The International Monetary Fund. This is basically an international banking system that is going to basically give loans to countries that are developing and basically to help them build an infrastructure and to improve infrastructures like road systems and bridges, canals, dams, things like that they need to build themselves up. And the World Trade Organization, free trade, basically promoting good economic relations on the basis of trade around the world. A lot of countries are a part of this. Some are associates of it. So it's one of the better working organizations. Right. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is basically a no tax deal between the US, Mexico, and Canada. This one has been in the news in recent years as trying to completely redo it or get rid of it. So it's, and that's kind of along the lines of that it was not a great deal for the US and that it more helped out Mexico and Canada, especially Mexico, because companies in the US would be sending factories and jobs to places like Mexico because it's cheaper labor. So there are good and bad associated with NAFTA. All right, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. This was the big military alliance that the United States and Great Britain, France, places like that were a part of during the course of the Cold War. And it was developed to oppose the spread of communism and the Warsaw Pact was formed by the Soviet Union in response to NATO. Warsaw Pact is no longer around. It died out at the same time that the Soviet Union died out. But NATO is still in practice today. And many, many more nations have joined it since then, including Russia, if I'm not mistaken. All right, and that is where we will be ending today. All right, so come back next time and we will continue and finish up what is left of the information for World History 2.